February 14, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Dawn. The wind carries fine Saharan sand through the narrow mountain corridor, stinging the faces of American soldiers crouched behind hastily dug foxholes. The air tastes of dust and diesel. In the pre-dawn darkness, the rumble begins, distant at first, then growing, a mechanical thunder that seems to shake the very stones of the dorsal mountains. Through the morning haze they come, German Panzer IVs and Tiger tanks, their steel hulls painted in desert camouflage, advancing with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. The Americans, many of them boys who had never seen combat 3 months prior, grip their rifles with white knuckles. Some pray, others simply stare. They do not yet know they are about to experience the most humiliating defeat in American military history on the North African continent. What they cannot possibly imagine is that this moment of absolute failure will forge them into something their enemy never anticipated. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his command vehicle that morning, binoculars raised, watching the American lines buckle. The famed Desert Fox had arrived in Tunisia with contempt barely concealed behind his tactical assessments. He had spent 2 years fighting the British 8th Army across North Africa, soldiers hardened by years of war, led by competent commanders who understood desert warfare. Now he faced Americans, fresh from a nation he considered soft, led by generals who had never commanded men in battle. In his personal journals and communications to Berlin, Rommel's assessment was cutting. He wrote of American troops as poorly trained, their equipment inferior, their officers inexperienced. The Americans, he observed, possessed material abundance, but lacked the warrior spirit necessary for modern mechanized warfare. They were shopkeepers and farmers playing at soldiers. Kasserine Pass, he believed, would prove his assessment correct. Within 48 hours, his forces would shatter the American defensive line, capturing over 6,000 prisoners, destroying nearly 200 tanks, and sending the survivors fleeing in disarray across 30 miles of desert. The German and Italian soldiers who pursued the retreating Americans through those February days felt vindicated in their assumptions. Letters home spoke of easy victories, of American soldiers abandoning equipment, of officers losing control of their units. One German officer wrote to his wife that the Americans fought like they were still training in peacetime. The Axis forces expected the pattern to continue. These Americans would break again and again until they were driven back across the Atlantic or sued for peace in North Africa. The Afrika Korps veterans, men who had survived Tobruk and El Alamein, looked at their new enemy and saw confirmation of their belief in German superiority. The Americans had factories and resources, yes, but they lacked the iron discipline and combat experience that forged true soldiers. Rommel himself believed he had perhaps 3 months before the weight of American industrial production became problematic. 3 months to exploit their inexperience, to shatter their will, to send them home defeated. But something unexpected began in the days immediately following Kasserine Pass, something the Germans did not anticipate because they fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. The American military did not hide its defeat. Commanders from Eisenhower down through division and battalion level conducted brutal, honest assessments. Staff officers compiled reports documenting every failure, the inadequate reconnaissance, the poor coordination between armor and infantry, the confusion in the chain of command, the failure of American tank destroyers against German armor. Unlike armies built on rigid hierarchy and the suppression of initiative, the American system demanded accountability and adaptation. Within a week of the disaster, commanders were being reassigned. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose confused orders and poor leadership had contributed to the debacle, was relieved and sent back to the United States. In his place came Major General George S. Patton, a man who understood that wars were won not just with steel, but with the psychology of absolute determination. Patton arrived in Morocco on March 6, 1943, wearing his polished helmet, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his sides. He immediately instituted changes that seemed almost superficial to outside observers, but addressed something fundamental. Every soldier would wear proper uniform, every helmet would be strapped, salutes would be crisp, military courtesy would be enforced. Discipline, he understood, was not about arbitrary rules. It was about building an army that functioned as a single organism, where orders were followed instantly because trust and structure had been established. But Patton did more than enforce discipline. He trained his men relentlessly. Tank crews practiced coordinating with infantry. Artillery units learned to respond to calls for fire within minutes. Air-ground coordination, nearly non-existent at Kasserine, became a priority drilled into every operation. The Americans possessed something the Germans could not replicate: the ability to learn from failure without destroying the institutional framework, to adapt without losing cohesion, to transform humiliation into motivation. The German intelligence officers monitoring American movements noted the changes but misread their significance. They saw the replacement of commanders, the increased training tempo, the enforcement of military discipline. They interpreted these as cosmetic adjustments, a desperate attempt by an embarrassed military to save face. What they failed to recognize was that the American industrial and educational system had produced something unique in military history: an army of soldiers who could think independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and utilize technology with an intuitive understanding that came from growing up in a mechanized civilian society. The average American soldier had grown up driving cars, operating farm machinery, repairing household equipment. The German soldier was often more disciplined, more indoctrinated, but the American soldier was more flexible, more capable of improvisation. At Kasserine, this hadn't mattered because the Americans were disorganized and poorly led, but give them competent leadership, clear objectives, and time to learn, and they would become something formidable. The transformation revealed itself at El Guetar on March 23, 1943, barely 5 weeks after Kasserine. Rommel had already departed Africa by then, exhausted and ill, but his replacement, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, expected the pattern to continue. The Germans launched an attack with elements of the 10th Panzer Division, confident that American lines would crack as they had before. Instead, they encountered an enemy that had evolved. American artillery, coordinated with devastating precision, tore into the German advance. Tank destroyer battalions, properly positioned and supported by infantry, knocked out German tanks at ranges the Germans hadn't expected the Americans to effectively utilize. When the German armor tried to flank, they found American units that held their positions, that fought with a cohesion that hadn't existed a month earlier. The attack stalled, then broke. The 10th Panzer Division retreated, leaving behind burning vehicles and shattered expectations. The Americans held. More importantly, they pursued. Through April and into May, the American II Corps, now functioning as an integrated fighting force, pushed across Tunisia alongside British and French units. At Hill 609, American infantry assaulted German positions with a ferocity that stunned defenders. The battle was brutal, close quarters fighting in rocky terrain where American soldiers learned that victory required not just firepower, but the willingness to close with the enemy and destroy him. They took the hill. At Bizerte, American forces coordinated armor, artillery, infantry, and air power in a combined arms assault that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. The Germans defending Tunisia found themselves fighting an enemy that now matched them in tactical competence, while vastly exceeding them in material support. Every German tank destroyed stayed destroyed. Every American tank knocked out was replaced, often within days. Every casualty the Germans suffered depleted irreplaceable veteran units. Every American casualty was replaced by fresh troops flowing across the Atlantic in an endless stream. The symbolic difference revealed itself in the simplest things. German soldiers in Tunisia by April 1943 were on half rations, their supply lines strangled by Allied naval and air superiority. They fought hungry, conserving ammunition, knowing no reinforcements were coming. American soldiers, by contrast, ate hot meals even in forward positions. Supply trucks brought not just ammunition and fuel, but cigarettes, mail from home, sometimes even ice cream. A German prisoner captured in late April stared in disbelief at the American supply depot, rows of trucks, pallets of ammunition, fuel drums stacked like mountains. He asked his captors how they could possibly lose when they had so much. The American guard, a farm boy from Iowa, shrugged and said they didn't plan to. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand narrative of military operations, but it represented something the Germans had never quite grasped. American abundance was not a weakness, but a weapon, the physical manifestation of an economic system that could outproduce any enemy while maintaining domestic prosperity. By May 13th in 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers went into captivity, more prisoners than the Soviets had taken at Stalingrad 3 months earlier. For Hitler and the German High Command, the disaster was compounded by the nature of the defeat. They had expected to hold Tunisia, to make the Allies pay for every mile with blood and time. Instead, the Axis forces had been encircled, cut off, and systematically destroyed. The Americans, written off as inferior soldiers after Kasserine Pass, had been instrumental in that destruction. German intelligence officers reviewing the campaign struggled to explain what had happened. How had an army that broke in February become an army that won decisively in May? The answer lay in something the German military system, for all its tactical brilliance, could not replicate: the capacity for institutional learning, the willingness to admit failure and restructure, the combination of industrial might and adaptable doctrine. Rommel himself, recovering in Germany, read the reports from Tunisia with something approaching disbelief. He had been right that the Americans were inexperienced at Kasserine. He had been catastrophically wrong in assuming that inexperience was permanent. In his later writings and conversations, Rommel acknowledged what he had missed. The Americans learned faster than any army he had ever faced. They brought engineering precision to warfare, treating each battle as a problem to be analyzed and solved. Where the German army relied on the brilliance of individual commanders and the discipline of veteran troops, the American army created systems that functioned regardless of individual genius. They built an army that could replace losses, adapt tactics, and maintain offensive pressure indefinitely. The Desert Fox, who had humiliated British generals and earned grudging respect from his enemies, had underestimated the Americans based on a single battle. That miscalculation, multiplied across every theatre of the war, would contribute to Germany's destruction. The soldiers who survived Kasserine Pass and went on to fight through Tunisia carried that transformation with them. They landed in Sicily in July 1943, veterans now, their equipment upgraded, their tactics refined. They hit the beaches at Salerno and Anzio, fought through the mountains of Italy, where every ridge was defended and every valley was a killing ground. They learned urban warfare at Cassino, tank warfare in the hedgerows of Normandy, winter warfare in the Ardennes. Each battle added to their institutional knowledge. Each campaign refined their doctrine. The German soldiers who fought them in 1944 and 1945 faced an enemy unrecognizable from the one that had fled at Kasserine. These Americans moved with confidence, coordinated air and ground operations seamlessly, brought overwhelming firepower to bear on any position. They were not supermen. They made mistakes, suffered defeats, died in terrible numbers, but they represented something the Axis powers could never match, an industrial democracy that turned its productive capacity toward war while maintaining the flexibility and innovation that rigid autocracies suppressed. The wind still blows through Kasserine Pass today, carrying the same Saharan sand across stones that witnessed both American defeat and the beginning of American vindication. The pass is quiet now, marked by memorials and the rusted debris of war slowly being reclaimed by the desert. But the lessons learned there echoed through every subsequent American military campaign. The willingness to honestly assess failure, to replace commanders who fail, to adapt doctrine based on battlefield results, to trust in institutional systems rather than individual genius, these became hallmarks of American military culture. Rommel proved right about one thing. The Americans who arrived in North Africa in 1942 were unprepared for modern warfare. But he was wrong about what that meant. He saw weakness where there was instead a formidable capacity for growth, for learning, for transformation. The Americans did not need to be perfect from the beginning. They needed only to be willing to learn from their mistakes faster than their enemies could exploit them. In that capacity lay a strength more enduring than tactical brilliance or battlefield heroism, the strength of a system built on honesty, adaptability, and the assumption that failure was not final, but instructional. The tanks that burned at Kasserine were replaced. The soldiers who fled were retrained and returned to battle. The commanders who failed were relieved and replaced by better men. And in that process, in that willingness to confront failure and build something better from its ruins, the Americans proved that Rommel's contempt was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding. They were not soft, they were not defeated, they were learning, and in the crucible of North African warfare they forged themselves into the army that would storm across Europe and bring the Third Reich to its knees. The Desert Fox had been wrong, and that mistake, like so many others made by Axis commanders who underestimated American resolve and adaptability, would cost them everything.